Hello, my name is Aidan and Ruppert, alongside me, Rob Murray, and welcome to episode 5 of the WCHC Sports Podcast, where we discuss the latest news and updates from around the sports world. Whether you're here for the first time or you just keep coming back, be sure to subscribe to our WCHC Sports 88.1 FM YouTube page for weekly updates on all things sports. Today, Rob and I will be spending most of our time discussing what will surely be remembered as a historic week in sports, as athletes across many of our leagues said enough is enough and went on strike for multiple days to protest racial injustice and inequality. Rob, definitely not the most lighthearted week in sports, but certainly a discussion for us that's worth having.
That's right, Aidan. It was a week in sports unlike anything we'd ever seen before. But then again, 2020 has also been a moment in time we'll never forget. I think what we've seen transpire over the last few days highlights how truly different sports and its influence on our society have become. And it'll really make for some interesting conversations on the role of athletes, even just one decade ago, as opposed to the athletes of the modern day.
So before we get into things here, WCHC Sports would like to hear from you. What are your thoughts on the podcast, and what would you like to see in the future? Be sure to leave a comment on this video or contact WCHC Sports at g.holycross.edu today. We hope to hear from you. So, Rob, obviously it is worth mentioning that we are not a political podcast, nor are we pretending to be, quite frankly. And it's certainly not our intent to tell people they need to think one way or another on most issues. And we actually hope that our coverage of sports can really serve to bring people together in a politically polarized world. But that said, if this past week has taught us anything, it's that American sports have in many ways become inseparable from the political sphere, at least in terms of a lot of athletes, leagues, teams have attempted to use their platform and visibility to shed light on issues, most notably systemic racism and police brutality. And so, Rob, I thought you and I could start things off with the NBA, seeing as that's where a lot of what's going on right now is stemming from. But first and foremost, what has this past week really been like for you as a sports fan? It's definitely, for me, been an unprecedented week with a lot of uncertainty. So what's it been like?
Yeah, Aidan, as a lifelong fan of sports, I thought professionals playing in front of an empty stadium would be one of the most unprecedented things I'd ever see. But what happened this past week is absolutely up there too. Not that this was an enormous surprise to me. I think athletes have become more and more vocal over the years regarding social issues. You saw Colin Kaepernick in 2016. And going back to the NBA, the players voiced their displeasures with former Clippers owner Donald Sterling, and they threatened to do a strike in that time as well. Well, this was the first time we'd seen multiple leagues not only speak out over social unrest, but have their games, playoff games, mind you, for some leagues canceled as a result. You saw postponement of the NBA, along with the Stanley Cup playoffs on Thursday and Friday, and multiple teams across Major League Baseball sat out their games over that time period as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, for all intents and purposes, unprecedented, for better or for worse. So definitely a turbulent week in the world of sports. And so, as mentioned, the spotlight has really been on the NBA this past week as the first domino to fall in terms of athletes going on strike. As on August 26th, the Milwaukee Bucks did not take the floor for Game 5 of their playoff series against the Orlando Magic. And it quickly became clear to those who follow the league that the team was taking a stand against recent events in their home state of Wisconsin. So other playoff games were quickly postponed as well, and there were reports that night of a heated meeting amongst players, coaches, and league officials in the NBA bubble to discuss whether or not the playoffs would even continue or if they would just pack up and go home in light of recent events. And thankfully for us as sports fans, the NBA did elect to resume play, but what a nerve-wracking night it was. And many have actually compared it in recent days to March 11th, 2020, which, as you may recall, was the night the NBA stoppage began in response to Rudy Gobert's positive coronavirus test. And personally, I was just, throughout all of this that went down, I was just glued to my phone trying to keep up with the Woj bombs and all of the news sort of as it broke. It was a lot to take in.
Absolutely. I watched the situation very closely as well, not only NBA, but across all leagues. And it really had me thinking for a while what roles athletes currently play in our society and almost how the public perception of American sports has undergone such rapid change in a relatively short amount of time. It seems like leagues like the NBA and the NFL in particular have become somewhat of their own political platforms by generating discussions, change, controversy, and everything else in between. And it feels like sports, as you said, have become inseparable from politics. And to some, it's a very positive transformation. They believe it's a productive use of one of the biggest entertainment industries in our country. But for others, they'd rather have sports be a separate entity from our political issues and act as a brief, relaxing escape from the world's problems, and something we can all rally behind regardless of what we believe or who we vote for. Yet, regardless of what people believe is the best path for sports, I think it's certainly hard to deny the impact of this past week's strikes on both the short and long-term futures of all these major sports leagues and their involvement in social affairs. This is a pattern I'm sure all of these leagues will continue to follow in the coming months and years.
Yeah, I think you sort of hit the nail on the head, Rob. And first and foremost, you're right in that different people are bound to feel different ways about just how sports are becoming increasingly political. Actually, here's a funny story. Just last night, I was out to dinner with my family and grandmother while wearing a Celtics shirt, as usual. And a guy in the parking lot, he was wearing a Boston Bruins shirt, and he stopped me and said to me, "I like your shirt. I don't agree with what the league is doing, but I like your shirt." And to me, I think he's certainly entitled to that opinion. Just a few weeks back, you and I, Rob, we talked about just how lucky we are to finally have sports back to briefly escape from an otherwise really unforgiving year that is 2020. And I think there's certainly bound to be some frustration in postponing or even canceling sporting events after so many league executives put in so much work to finally resume play. You talk about all the logistics that went into, for example, the NHL, MLB, and the NBA bubble. It's also true, though, that athletes do possess a platform larger than most. And the fact that they're now using this platform to call for change, it certainly is a sign of the times. And regardless of how one feels, I do think it will be interesting to see just where things go from here in terms of A, bringing about real change, B, the viewership and economics of each league, and C, players' relationships with media members. So obviously the postponement of several NBA playoff games understandably posed an inconvenience to league officials and broadcast partners, but it was ultimately manageable for the league as all games were merely pushed back 2 days with the rest of the schedule proceeding as planned. But you mentioned the MLB, and I know there are a lot of people that are starting to have some really serious doubts about the way the schedule is looking from here on out in terms of teams' actual ability to complete a 60-game slate by the end of September. The players' strike, however one may feel about them, certainly didn't help the MLB's ability to squeeze in all these games, as COVID keeps creeping up on teams enforcing cancellations or postponements, rather. And between several teams partaking in the strike and postponements due to COVID, what are you, Rob, hearing on the MLB's scheduling dilemma these days?
Well, before I start, you said it, Aidan. Coronavirus has already put the majority of the league's teams behind the eight ball, and this brief holdout we saw across sports only put more pressure on Major League Baseball to finish out their 60-game season by September 27th, which is currently scheduled to be the last day of the baseball year. This means you'll have teams like the St. Louis Cardinals and the Miami Marlins and the Phillies needing to play 30 to 35 games in the span of less than a month. Even teams who have been mostly impervious to coronavirus have still needed to play one or two doubleheaders every week. I saw my Cubs play a doubleheader against the Reds this past week, even though they haven't had a COVID-19 case all year. And you know, Aidan, with all these teams seemingly going at warp speed to finish these games, durability and performance issues are going to start to come into play, and they already are, with especially pitchers getting such short rest. You're seeing a spike in throwing arm injuries, in large part due to the expedited schedule, like I mentioned before, as well as the inability to properly prep for the season in the absence of spring training. We had lockdowns at the beginning of March, going through April and even into the beginning of May. And that really put pitchers specifically in a very difficult position to train the right way and get their arms ready for a long season. Another thing I'd like to see out of all this is this year's run total and pitching stats compared to other seasons through the first 60 games. My best guess would be that we're going to see this season largely as a nightmare for pitching staffs in terms of ERA and WHIP and innings pitched, and more of a dream scenario for batters as they get to take advantage of pitchers that are clearly hurting and struggling with their efficiency on the mound.
Yeah, I think that efficiency definitely could come into play. And, I think a lot of the players would argue that they are willing to grit their teeth and play these doubleheaders if it means, one, taking a day or two off to make a powerful political statement, and B, just as important, ensuring their own safety in the midst of COVID-19. But still, I can definitely see a scenario where sort of this scheduling really begins to drain players physically and mentally headed into the postseason, especially your point on the pitching staffs and what that's going to look like moving forward. So obviously the stoppages, though brief, had implications on the scheduling of games for the foreseeable future. As an unintended consequence, various playoff series, particularly in the NBA, were impacted by the strike, as players were given a few extra days to heal up from minor injuries and return to play. So you talk about these unintended consequences. I think the series we want to start with is probably Houston OKC in basketball, where Russell Westbrook, who's been dealing with a quad injury, was actually able to return for the postponed Game 5 and ultimately lead his team to a 3-2 lead over the Thunder.
Yeah, you're seeing the same with Kyle Lowry, another guy who was questionable for Game 1 in his series against the Celtics, being upgraded to active after having a few days extra to rest. He did struggle a lot in that loss, as did Westbrook in their game against the Thunder. But having both of those guys back will be a big boost to the Rockets and the Raptors, respectively, as they continue their playoff push.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned Kyle Lowry struggling against Boston Game 1. I mean, I was all for it, obviously, as a Celtics fan. But for Toronto, I'm sure they would rather have had him back for that Game 1 as opposed to bringing him back Game 2 and then needing him to spend that time shaking off the rust. So ultimately, it is an unintended consequence, but a minor positive spin that the teams can't put on these stoppages. And lastly, for basketball, how about Gary Harris of the Denver Nuggets? He's a guy who has not played in, I think it's about 6 months now, as he sustained a hip injury upon entering the NBA bubble. And so he was able to continue his rehab for an extra couple days during the stoppage and return for a win or go home Game 6 against Utah. And this was frankly a huge addition for Denver, as he's one of the team's better defenders that they can throw at the surging Donovan Mitchell. And Mitchell still got his 44 points during Game 6, but he's definitely going to come into play for Game 7, as I don't believe he is on a minutes restriction. And if anyone's going to stop this man Mitchell, it has to be Gary Harris, I would imagine.
For sure. When you get into a Game 7, it's all hands on deck. You've seen it time and time again across every sport. In baseball, if it's Game 7 of the World Series, you have guys on 1 or 2 days rest pitching into the late innings. Or in hockey, a Game 7 Stanley Cup final, you have guys taking pucks to the face, taking big hits, and staying in the game because they know after this game it might be it for the rest of the season. But shifting from the NBA to the MLB, I just wanted to throw in a point going back to our discussion about pitching and how they've been affected by coronavirus and this brief stoppage. at least that break would have been able to give some of these pitchers a much needed day off coming out of the bullpen as they continue their seasons.
So, despite the irregularities we have encountered in this last week of sports, it's only fitting that Rob and I close things off the only way we know how, with our assists, fumbles, and what to watch for. So, for my assist of the week, I would like to commend the NBA for taking the time to acknowledge several prominent figures that we have lost over the past few days alone. Prior to each of Saturday's playoff games, the league televised a moment of silence for former NBA All-Star Cliff Robinson, legendary University of Arizona coach Lute Olson, and renowned actor/activist Chadwick Boseman, who all passed away within a 48-hour window. And while players and teams are right now looking to the future to answer the question of what's next for this country, they have not forgotten to acknowledge those who came before them. And Rob, I think the NBA will put forth a similar tribute to legendary Georgetown coach John Thompson Jr., who passed away just this morning. In 1984, Thompson became the first African-American coach to win the NCAA championship, and he will be sorely missed by many.
Absolutely, Aiden. And I'd like to touch on a couple of these guys that you just mentioned. Cliff Robinson was actually someone who lived on my street, obviously well before that I was alive, but he occupied one of the houses on my road in Connecticut. And I always thought that was pretty cool. He also played for the University of Connecticut in college, which I surely appreciated. And with John Thompson, we were talking before recording about a great story with him and Allen Iverson, and how Iverson was arrested after his junior year, and pretty much any and all offers that were going his way for college basketball were rescinded, except John Thompson was the only one who took a chance on Iverson, and he was able to coach one of the best players in college basketball and NBA history. So it was a great story to see that John Thompson was a guy who could really connect to all of his players, regardless of the circumstance. And the basketball world really lost a legend today. For me, though, I was quite happy to see that recently retired NBA legend Vince Carter will be joining the NBA on ESPN crew as an analyst next season, bringing some much-needed talent onto a program known for its notorious hot takes from the likes of Paul Pierce, Kendrick Perkins, and Jalen Rose. And while I don't think anyone could rise to the entertainment and comedy level of the NBA on TNT with Shaq and Charles Barkley, seeing a guy like Vince Carter, who has been such an incredible ambassador for the game of basketball, continue to be part of the game is great to watch. A lot of people forget he did so much for growing basketball, not only in the United States as an all-star and a slam dunk contest champion, but internationally. His time in the Olympics and tenure with the Toronto Raptors brought fans together from all around the world and really help extend the influence of the NBA overseas. And now he's able to make similar waves on television and provide valuable insight to diehard fans like yourself, Aidan, and more casual fans like myself.
You know, that's a great call, Rob, with Vince Carter. He's such a professional and really a well-spoken guy, as perhaps is in evidence by teams' willingness to keep him around into his early 40s. You know, some wonder, what has he been doing these past two seasons with the Atlanta Hawks, who, for all intents and purposes, were going nowhere with a roster like that. But just having a locker room guy like him around with the likes of John Collins, Trae Young, among others, it will do wonders for your team in that stage of development. So I also look forward to Vince Carter joining ESPN and really bringing a lot of great insight into the program. He's a funny guy also, so I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he's going to do great on TV. He reminds me of, guys like Tony Romo and Jason Witten and even Peyton Manning in football, who were great locker room presences and were really team leaders and knew so much about the game, really cerebral guys making the leap to television. Tony Romo is, in my opinion, one of the best football commentators we have today. And I think Peyton Manning, if given the opportunity later on, there's a lot of rumors circulating about which network he would go to call football. I think he'd be a tremendous addition to the booth in terms of his expertise and knowledge of the game of football.
Definitely. So I'm not going to throw shade at any particular athlete for my fumble for this week, though Marcus Morris of the Clippers certainly appears a prime candidate given his exchanges and incidents with Luka Doncic this past week. Instead, though, I am going to give the sports video game world a shout out, as Friday's release of Madden 21 has been met with overwhelming negativity from gamers everywhere. Users have demanded that the NFL drop its partnership with EA Sports, as the new game, Madden 21, has been viewed as unforgivably sloppy and stale product. And Madden 21, in fact, received the worst Metacritic score of all time, with, get this, only a 0.4 out of 10. And Rob, as you know, I'm more of an NBA 2K guy myself, and I can only hope that 2K21's release this week does not warrant a similar reaction, as I just pre-ordered 2 days ago.
Yeah, I'm gonna piggyback on your fumble of the week, Aidan. While I do understand the logistical problems COVID-19 presents in the creation of a video game or a movie or any kind of digital media, as someone who has also been very frustrated with EA Sports' utter incompetence and laziness with the Madden franchise, I can only laugh when realizing it was just a few short months ago that the NFL renewed their contract with EA Sports through 2026, which ensures us another 6 years of subpar simulation football. But luckily, independent games like Maximum Football and 2K Football are soon to make their respective appearances and hopefully challenge EA to come out with a better product that better serves diehard football fans. So here's to hoping competition and the good old free market works its magic to save sports gamers and football fans alike.
Well, definitely, Rob. And I do know that EA Sports, they do have it in them. As much of a 2K fan as I am, my favorite sports video game of all time was NBA Street Volume 3, produced by none other than EA Sports. So I know that if they put their heads together and work their magic, they can sort of right the ship, so to speak. But we'll see how it turns out. So my what to watch for this week is the easiest choice I have made for this segment since Rob and I began the podcast. And without a doubt, Tuesday's Game 7 between the Denver Nuggets and the Utah Jazz is looking like the most exciting NBA game we have seen all year. This entire series has been simply breathtaking, as Donovan Mitchell and Jamal Murray have been the two best players in the postseason by a mile, with all due respect to Kawhi Leonard, Luka Doncic, and Giannis Antetokounmpo. Both Murray and Mitchell have dropped 50-point games twice, exchanging clutch shot after clutch shot on multiple occasions. And I know that a lot of people may point to, say, Clippers Spurs in 2015, Celtics Bulls in 2009, or some of those older series from the 80s and 90s as perhaps the most exciting first-round series ever. But for me, this is the most entertaining first-round matchup I have ever watched. And Game 7 is at 8:30 p.m. Tuesday night. And to me, Rob, it is must-see TV.
Yeah, I can't argue with that, Aidan. Any Game 7 is certainly hard to miss, especially with the way the Nuggets and the Jazz have battled it out through these first six. But I'll also be tuning into the start of the Eastern Conference semifinals as the Heat and the Bucks and the Celtics-Raptors matchup, which is currently 1-0 Celtics after they really dismantled the Raptors in Game 1, should provide some much-needed clarity to what looks like a much closer race in the East after the Bucks had their fair share of struggles against Orlando, while the Heat, Celtics, and Raptors made rather quick work of their first-round opponents. And Aidan, while I'm certainly not a Boston sports advocate, I think you know that better than anyone, it's awfully difficult to ignore the depths of your Celtics team and how easy they've made things look through their first 5 games. I mean, Jason Tatum, for one, has been incredible. And I think a player like him can use, his first, I'm going to say, real playoff experience, because, the past few years, he was an important part of that team, but he was never the guy on those 2018, 2019 Celtics playoff teams. But now, with the offense, surrounding him, the ball's in his court, so to speak, and he's really risen to the occasion, unlike anyone else has this postseason, if you want to exclude Donovan Mitchell and Jamal Murray for the sake of the argument.
Yeah, Rob, I'm with you. I think 2018, Jason Tatum, he was outstanding as a rookie, but really that Celtics team, you may recall, was playing with house money as no Hayward, no Kyrie, and somehow they pushed to 7 games against the Cavs in the Eastern Conference Finals. And there was that play Tatum dunked on LeBron, flexed on him. I ultimately think it cost him the game.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that you're right. This is Tatum's first real chance to be the guy on a championship level team. And though I expect the Raptors to react or respond to the Celtics, I am definitely keeping my eye on the other series as, in my opinion, if anyone can dethrone the Bucks out east, I think it's Miami. I think that if Milwaukee gets through this one, they're going to the finals. I don't think the Raptors or Celtics quite have what it takes. But I think that Miami, just with their players, Adebayo, Butler, Dragic is playing out of this world too. I think if anyone's going to really give them a run for their money, I think that it's the Heat this round. So we'll see how that plays out. So that about wraps things up for a bit of a shortened episode 5 of the WCHC Sports Podcast. And Rob and I will be back to providing more in-depth coverage of the NBA, NHL, MLB, and more, starting with episode 6 next weekend. Until then, this is Aidan Ruppert alongside Rob Murray signing off.